video remakes all have a lot in common, and when they get it right, they really get it right. Why though? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Game Ranks, we put together a list of 10 things every remake should have. Now, keep in mind, a remake not having one of these things isn't automatically it being a bad remake. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't try. So with that in mind, let's talk about these things that, well, remakes should have. Starting off at number 10, they should look better than the original. That's the baseline, right? You think it doesn't even have to be said because most remakes do look way better than the original, but that doesn't mean all of them do. For every Final Fantasy VII remake that's so far beyond the original, it's practically upsetting. I mean, think if somebody saw these graphics in 1997, their head would completely explode. They look better than the pre-rendered cutscenes that were on the cutting edge of rendering technology at the time. But, there's stuff that looks worse, too. Like that terrible 13 remake, Warcraft 3 Reforged, or, the many ways the GTA Definitive Edition trilogy thing collection was anything but definitive. The thing with remakes is that a lot of publishers see them as a low-risk way to make some scratch, so they don't put all the money they should into them, and that results in, well, I guess the results speak for themselves. In 2024 especially, we've been spoiled by high-quality, carefully considered remakes. This was, of course, not always the case, and while there are a few stinker remakes that come out every so often still, in general, they're a lot better now than they used to be, and at least they do look a lot better. Even games that are only a few years old get pretty significant graphic upgrades, like the recent Horizon Zero Dawn remake. I made people pretty mad on Twitter by saying I thought Horizon Zero Dawn needed a remake because of the Potato People original character models. See, in their mind, I was saying that Aloy needs to be hot, otherwise the game is bad. But no, I was saying that all of the NPCs in the game look like Potato People, and now they don't. Now they look like the people in Horizon Forbidden West, and I like that. But they didn't stop there. Everything in the game looks way better. Things are much more dense and lush and pretty. It's a good remake. Is it the most necessary thing that's ever been done? No, but it looks better, objectively speaking. Now, do remakes need to look better at the expense of everything else? No. Ideally, a remake needs to do a lot of things, but this is one thing that is kind of the basics of what a remake should be. They don't even have to look that much better. Even a bump up in resolution and especially a better frame rate is good enough for me. But the one thing they should absolutely never look like is worse. Rockstar and GTA Definitive Edition. That shouldn't happen. And number 9, they should keep everything from the original. When a game gets remade, you want it to capture the experience of playing the original, and that means they should, for the most part, keep everything in the original game. All the levels, enemies, equipment, that should all be here and accounted for, and nothing should be missing or significantly altered. Most remakes manage to pull this off because they're not particularly ambitious. They're replicating the original as much as possible. Sometimes when you get into the weeds with little details, certain effects of little secrets get lost, but for the most part, everything major in the game is retained. Some games really go the extra mile and absolutely include everything, like the Super Mario RPG remake. They're retained, everything. Every bizarre secret little Easter egg that maybe 0.01% of players would ever see. It's all there. Some other games don't try that hard, though. An unfortunate example is like the Resident Evil 3 remake, which is a short game that's missing some major sections from the original game. It feels incomplete, and if you played the original, the missing segments stand out quite a bit and do leave you with a bit of a disappointed feeling. Another one that I have kind of a big old problem with is the Persona 3 remake. Granted, they did get everything from the original game in there, but basically nobody considers the original game the full game because Persona 3 Portable exists, and it included all of the add-ons and stuff from the original game, so it basically made it into one game. Now, I'll say this, that doesn't mean the Persona 3 remake is bad. It's actually far superior to the original game. But that doesn't mean you aren't disappointed that the stuff you played in Portable isn't there. And on top of that, they aren't making it to release as DLC later, so it's always never going to have that. Like, even Resident Evil 4, they cut the U3 fight, and that felt wrong. Everything else about the game was pretty faithful, but they cut a major boss at the finish line. It's just weird. Thankfully, they brought it back for the Separate Ways DLC and even managed to expand on it, but its absence from the main game still feels off as somebody who's played the original so many times. That's the danger of remaking some of these gigantic games, Final Fantasy VII in particular. Like, as massive as Rebirth ended up being, and how much it expands on the original game, it did lose some of the goofier monsters from the original. Like, justice for the Tricero tank, right? And yeah, I know they say one of the enemies is supposed to be the same thing in Rebirth, but there aren't any tank treads, so it's not the same thing, Square Enix. You're not fooling me. At number 8, the gameplay should be enhanced. Not all remakes are considered equal, of course, and not all remakes are built for the same reasons. So some of the things I'm going to say here probably are going to end up sounding a little contradictory, and like I said at the beginning, not having something from this list isn't necessarily a major ding against the game for whatever reason. I even said in the last point, I really love the Persona 3 remake. But the gameplay needing to be enhanced definitely sounds contradictory to they should keep everything from the original game, but let me go ahead and say something. Some remakes are made to just bring an old game to a new platform, and others are more about completely rebuilding a game from the ground up to make it more appealing to a modern audience, even fixing perceived flaws about the original. Now, not every single remake should completely overhaul the whole gameplay experience, but if they can, it should perhaps be enhanced when possible. I'm not even talking about anything huge here. The enhancement can be as simple as offering some modernized controls or accessibility features, for instance. On the other extreme end, remakes can do something like the Resident Evil 2 remake, where the game's pretty much completely different, going from tank controls and a fixed camera to over-the-shoulder and direct aiming, and honestly, many new or overhauled gameplay mechanics. The Resident Evil 4 remake isn't as much of a change, but let me tell you, I appreciate that not having tank controls thing. The Resident Evil 4 remake is built from the ground up for that. The Tomb Raider remake has a modern controls option that isn't perfect, but I prefer it, even though, you're kind of having to make some compromises to make the game work at times. But Resident Evil 4 didn't just change the tank controls, they added the new and improved knife. It really changes how the game feels. Like, it makes the skill ceiling higher, and it also makes melee combat a bigger part of the experience. There's a lot of games that make smart enhancements to old games, like Ratchet and Clank adding, the same kind of controls it has now to the remake, or the Bionic Commando remake adding new movement abilities. There's just a lot of different examples, big and small, but the best remakes are able to sometimes make sweeping changes that don't sacrifice what made the originals great. Again, not all the time, but sometimes.
Singularities and other cataclysmic events.
That's really more for educational purposes. It is always good to meet a fellow academic.
And at number 7, here is where you probably go, come on, what did you just say? But stick with me on this one. At number 7, they need to be faithful to the original. It's essential. If a remake doesn't feel like the same game, people developing the remake kind of have failed. Now, keep in mind, feeling like the same game doesn't mean being the same game, but that should be the number one priority. If the remake doesn't feel like a real update to the first game, I don't know what we're doing it for. You might as well just make a spiritual successor, a vaguely related sequel if the game's unable to capture the spirit of the original game. And that's really what I'm talking about here. Does it mean retaining every gameplay mechanic? Does it mean retaining every nuance and character and everything? No, it's the spirit. It has to capture that. And it sounds so obvious, but when a new developer comes in to make huge graphical updates to someone else's work, things get lost. This year, we've been really lucky with remakes that make sweeping graphical updates and still manage to feel right. Like, Silent Hill 2 Remake is a prime example. It's a game that changed so much about the original game from perspective. It added a lot mechanically, but it just has that same eerie, melancholic vibe and tone and pace, and it feels right. The spirit of the game is retained. The Dead Rising remake is another one that got a complete graphical overhaul. They made a lot of improvements to the controls, has totally new voice acting, but it all looks and feels right. They kept everything that counts. Now, some games are a little more controversial, like the remakes of Demon's Souls and Shadow of the Colossus, where a lot of the subtle changes build up to make a game that doesn't quite match the tone of the originals. Another game that can feel off is Twin Snakes, the Metal Gear Solid remake on GameCube. That one's a little more complicated. Some people really like the changes, others don't. But one thing I think we can generally agree on is that the voice work in the remake is mostly inferior to the original. With most remakes that try to be as slavishly accurate to the original as possible, accuracy usually isn't that big of an issue. You're usually just starting from the original base game and fixing stuff or making little tweaks. Most remakes are close enough in that way that it doesn't matter, but when they do try something new or the new team working on the game is far enough removed from the original devs, there can be situations where the remake just doesn't feel right. And none of them are the very best remakes out there. They don't do that. At number 6 is flaws should be fixed. A lot of developers take the opportunity with remakes to fix problems from the original. A lot of these are pretty objective, like you can't really argue that visually the original Final Fantasy VII is really dated in terms of look and comparably speaking to the remake looks like shit. That doesn't mean that the original graphics don't have a charm to them, a nostalgia, etc. We're not talking about the spirit of the game here. We're not even talking about taste. But it's not just visuals either. Sometimes great games have universally disliked parts that the remake has an opportunity to correct, like that turret section in Dead Space. That was the thing that kept me from replaying Dead Space. I'm not kidding. Like, I hate that part so much. I was just like, if I play that game again, I'm going to have to play that part again. And I don't want to. And then they released the remake, and it's like, all right, I can play Dead Space as much as I want. Like, that section is way more fun in the remake. And it doesn't even have to be entire sections of the game that get fixed either. It can be general gameplay stuff. Like the Nier remake, they overhauled the combat system to make it more like Nier Automata, and wow, is that better. Way less stiff. Or like Metro 2033 Redux, where they ported the original game into a new engine and pretty much overhauled every single little thing about the game, making it just a much better experience overall. It rarely happens, but sometimes a remake gets the opportunity to salvage an otherwise hated game. Like the Haunted Castle remake that got Surprise included with the Castlevania Dominus collection. The original Haunted Castle is terrible. It's easily the worst game of the series, and that is a low bar, but it is bad on just every level. But the remake, it's great. It's only tangentially the same game now, but it manages to capture the feel of the original while taking a game that sucked and actually making something good out of it. Usually only the best games get remakes, but even those games can have flaws. So if the opportunity is there to make changes like that, the best remakes fully take advantage of making bad games good or good games even better. At number 5, they should be enhanced and expanded. Remakes have to carefully thread the needle between being faithful to the original experience and having a satisfying gaming experience that a modern audience has come to expect. The older the game is, the more they need to not just be accurate to the original, but maybe do something above and beyond, you know? The best example is the Silent Hill 2 remake. The original clocked in about 8 hours, which the remake is probably about double that length. They added a lot to the game, and there's a real danger that can make the whole thing feel dragged out, and that new stuff feels at odds with the original. That game managed to pull it off very elegantly. Even though there's not really any new story content, it doesn't feel stretched thin and empty because of the new environments and expanded locations. I mean, they actually fit with the original game. Another game with maybe a little bit more mixed success rate, but a success rate, let's say. Black Mesa, which completely overhauled and massively expanded the entire Zen section of the game. It's the part the most people complained about in the original Half-Life, and not because of its length, just it was really annoying to get around. So the Black Mesa team did manage to fix a lot of the main complaints with that part of the game, but they also massively fleshed it out, making the original hour or two section about twice as long, and it does start to drag after a while. I do respect them for adding something new to the game. It is bigger and better. I would say that Zen now is better than Zen in the original Half-Life, but it could have been the, original length of Zen, and that would have made it like the right Zen, like the exactly right Zen. is another remake that added things. They added a new chapter to Act 2 that slots in fairly seamlessly with the original. That's probably due to the fact it's a segment that was cut from the original game, but still, this is the sort of thing I want to see. It doesn't have to be huge, but it's always satisfying to get something new that doesn't feel forced. Now, granted, there are ones that feel forced, like the crappy palette swap dungeons square slapped in the Final Fantasy remakes. Come on. You're just doing that to say that you added stuff. It's forced as hell. Stop it. Like, if new content sucks, it just makes the game worse. Thankfully, it seems like we've mostly moved away from the Mystic Mountain school of content for remakes, and for that, I am eternally grateful. At number 4 is some kind of bonus mode. It seems to be limited to just Nintendo's recent remake effort, and even then it's only a sometimes thing, but if we're going to get a bare bones remake or something that's not even that old, they should include some kind of bonus mode to sweeten the deal. Not talking about stuff that expands the original game. I mean, entirely new modes and games that get attached to the remake, like the bonus epilogue from Kirby's Return to Dreamland or Bowser's Fury that came packed in with Super Mario 3D World. Neither of those things are full games, but they give these basic remakes much more of a reason to exist. One of the best I've seen has to be the future connected bonus scenario that came with the Xenoblade Chronicles remaster. It adds a whole new area to the game, expands the story of the original game, and it does it in very interesting ways. It's not a feature a lot of remakes tend to have, or if they do, you got to pay extra for them. But I would love if this became a little more common in remakes. Getting something actually new and separate from the main game takes some sting off the fact I'm buying the same game for like the third time in a row in less than 10 years. At number 3, if it's an old school, particularly like turn-based and active time RPGs from back in the day, you got to have a speed-up function. Now, I've been talking about more general things, but I got to get specific here because it's a deal breaker. We've all tasted the forbidden fruit, and there's no going back now. If a remake of an RPG comes out, you have to increase the speed of the battles. There can be no negotiation. If the remake doesn't have it, then it's failed. It's not that I hate RPG battles or anything, but after a while they get tedious, and also I have things to do in my life as a 40-year-old adult that I didn't have as a 12-year-old kid. And to be frank, there's a lot of situations in games where you're just mashing attack to get through them. You have no reason to use any special moves or strategy or tactics or anything. It's just some weak enemies that you're stuck dealing with because of random battles. Oh, by the way, how about making it so you can turn off the random battles or change the frequency? That's always a good feature too, and I think kind of fits in with this point. So I want to give that a mention, but even if they don't do that, having some way to just speed through these little road bumps, it makes the game so much better. And if they're really serious, sometimes these RPGs actually try to balance things out and make battles more tactically interesting. But either way, they need to do something to speed things up. It's such a common feature now that not having anything just feels really wrong, especially if it's a remaster of a particularly old game where the battles are incredibly slow. Frankly, nothing else on this list really matters when it comes to RPGs. In all seriousness, everything else can go, the updated graphics, the new features, everything. I don't care if they do any of that as long as we have a speed up function. And number 2, the ability to swap between the new and the old graphics with the press of a button. Obviously, this only works for one-to-one remakes, but I don't know, I guess you could simulate old school graphics in a complete remake of a game, but it's never going to look the same. I'm mainly saying like something like, again, the Tomb Raider collection. This is a must-have if the game's just a straight graphics overhaul. It's not necessary, really, but it's so satisfying to instantly swap between the old graphics and the new. It really makes you appreciate the work the developers put into improving the visuals that might not be as easy to see without that direct comparison. It's fun to see a remake that's got graphics as good as what you vaguely remember in your head, but memory is imperfect. It tends to make things that you remember fondly look better over time. But having the direct comparison, that splash of water that reminds you what the game actually used to look like the Diablo 2 remake has an amazing version of this because the new 3D graphics are incredibly detailed and they did such a good job capturing the visual style that it's almost shocking going back to the original graphics where everything looks really blocky and dated. The Halo 1 remake had this. I mentioned the Tomb Raider collection as well, but the difference in the quality isn't so stark there. It's noticeable, but the Halo 1 remake is pretty old on its own, and the Tomb Raider collection is really limited by the design of the game. It can only look so much better. Still, it's great to see games with that graphics toggle, if only so we can play the game in the way that we want. For diehards, you want to play it like the old days, but for everyone who likes a new coat of paint, there's the option for them too. I like that. And number one, they should have something new. And I know I've said some points that are related to this, but stick with me. Like, yes, it's important for a remake to be true to the original. But the very best remakes are able to do that while also bringing something new to the table. It's not just the same game over again. They do something new and offer an interesting alternate route or take or whatever to the original. My favorite remakes are the ones that don't invalidate the original, but do something new and exciting with them. Like, it's great that Silent Hill 2 manages to keep everything good about the original game, but the most exciting parts of the remake are when there's something totally new, like the boss fights, or the part in the hotel where you lose all your weapons and have to avoid enemies. It's all variations of stuff from the base game, but they're done in a way that feels very different. The Resident Evil 2 remake radically reinvented the game by introducing a stalker enemy, Mr. X.
Jesus Christ!
And it completely changes how players would navigate the police station and made the whole thing much scarier. They took a great game and expanded on it, not just with new content, but with new ideas. And I have to say this too, after a while of playing with Mr. X in the game, I literally have had moments where I forgot that he was not part of the original game. They don't last long because I'm not completely senile, but sometimes when I'm playing the Resident Evil 2 remake, I have these like revelatory moments where I'm like, that wasn't in the other game. It just feels so natural and correct and good. And to be frank, it can be risky, like with the Final Fantasy VII remake, where it's not just a straight retelling of the original game, but a quasi-sequel that goes more and more off the rails as the series goes on. Honestly, the Final Fantasy VII remakes are basically new games. The only thing that's a remake about them is the story and characters. Basically, everything's totally different, but that's okay. They're an alternative to the original. They're not meant to replace it, and we really can't say if that whole experiment's going to work out until we get to the end of the game. I respect them for trying something new. That, and to be frank, even though it is that, they also succeed at capturing a lot of the original spirit from the original, so they still get that remake feel right. I mean, those are great games, up until now. Like, if they botch it with the third one, that's on them, but thus far, it's great. And that's hard to get right. But when Remakes manages to seriously do something new and innovate, it's exciting. There's the constant danger of going too far and alienating the original fans, but I love it when remakes aren't afraid to be bold. Even if it's something simple like a new boss fight or new enemies, at least there's something in it to surprise people who've grown up with the original. For as many remakes as we get these days, it's nice to see some surprises. It doesn't happen often, but I can't help but respect the game more when it does at least try.